In Conversation with Terri Shepherd, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Some queens are remembered, their names etched into history. Others remain in the shadows, mere footnotes to the men who ruled beside them. But what happens when one of those forgotten queens takes center stage? Terri Lewis's debut novel, Behold the Bird in Flight, a novel of an abducted queen, brings to life the fascinating yet little-known story of Isabelle d'Angoulême, a young woman caught in the dangerous game of power, ambition, and survival. Set in the medieval world, yet infused with strikingly contemporary feels, this novel reimagines the life of a queen whose story has been overlooked for centuries. Terri's own journey is just as remarkable. A former ballerina who performed in German opera houses, a circus artist, and a literary talent mentored by acclaimed authors Rebecca Mackay and Laura Vandenberg. She brings unique energy and originality to historical fiction with a vibrant storytelling style and a novel that defies genre norms. Terri Lewis is a writer to watch. Terri, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. I'm overwhelmed. Really good.
I was overwhelmed by Behold the Bird in Flight, and it's inspired by a real story. Give us the elevator speech that you use when you talk about your debut book.
Okay, I discovered her in 2 sentences in a book that I bought at Windsor Castle. And I was just completely taken by these 2 sentences. They said that there was this queen, Isabelle d'Angoulême. She was a daughter of a French count. She was abducted by the King of England, but she was abducted from a fiancé, Hugh de Lusignan. And to me, I'd never heard that story before, and I grew up reading about English queens and Henry VIII and all of that. And I just couldn't let go of it. So I started studying it, and that's how I came to write it. Just took me by the neck, sort of.
Tell me a little bit more about how you brought Isabelle to life on the page.
I always loved medieval history. In college, I had this great teacher, and he introduced it to us by having us read actual documents from the time. So I read a excommunication. I read a grant, a writ of when they would arrest someone. And the idea was to read the document and find out how the document affected the people that it was talking about. So he showed me that there was more to the medieval world than just what you receive on the page in high school. And I had a lot of books about medieval world. I liked the illuminations. I found them fascinating. When I traveled abroad, I went to a lot of castles and churches. And so I had this background. And then when I saw that this was a woman that interested me, I started researching specifically that period. And I read about the poetry that was written during the time. And they had a thing called books of how to behave. And you don't think about that, but I read some of those books, and I read about people who lived around. It was King John. I read about his knights and people who had helped him. And I actually just dived right in. So then when I came to write the book, I tried to look at all those things through Isabelle's eyes. But she was quite young. In the medieval era, you were considered a woman at 12. So she was young, and her viewpoint of things, I tried to see how she would have seen the king. Like the first time she saw the king, she noticed that he had a hole in his hose. Not that he was spectacular. She had expected someone in glamour and stuff, and she saw the hole in his hose. And then the king was enamored with her, and he invited her to sit with him, and she didn't know what to say to him. So I thought, now what is a young girl going to say to a king? And she always wanted to get out into the world. So she asked the king finally, are things in England like they are here in France? And that's how it got started. And he told her a story about a dancing bear and so on. But so I tried to focus on how she saw things. And I was able, as I wrote the story, to make her grow. So every experience that she had, she took in and she changed how she reacted a little bit. She started out with a very young friend. He was a scullery boy, but he was her best friend at the castle. And he got into terrible trouble and it caused problems for her. And she had to leave home. So that was her first step in her maturing. She had to leave home. She had to leave her parents. That was common in a medieval era, that children were sent away to be fostered so that they could grow into their own authority. And she was sent to a very fine castle. And she started to learn. They spoke Latin at the castle. Now, I'm not sure about that, but it was a possibility. So I said they spoke Latin, and she was used to speaking French. So now she had to learn Latin. And she was charged with a crime. Anyway, so every step that I saw forward, I tried to see what was happening around her with her eyes. Because I didn't want to put just history on the page. I wanted it to be immersive for the reader.
And your narrative style is distinctly modern and very accessible to present day readers. How did you balance that with historical accuracy?
That was it was a decision I made up front. I decided that I did want it to resonate with modern readers, but I didn't want it to be so modern, so I would use words that weren't used in the time. So my first rule was I never used contractions in dialogue. I used it in the narrative, but not in dialogue. My second rule was when I wanted to, when you finish writing your first, second, third draft, you start looking at verbs. And so I would look at verbs and I would say, when was that verb used? And can I get a better verb? And Merriam-Webster has this wonderful thing called word history. And you can look up the date that a verb or whatever was first used. And so I would look up these verbs, and if they were of either Anglo-Norman or of early French or Latin, I would say, yes, I can use that verb. And even if some of them came into usage in like the 1400s, but they were from the Latin. So they would have had that back usage in them. And so those were the decisions I made, and I tried to stick to it. Oh, and I also I needed some swear words because it was a tense time. There was wars going on and so on. So I chose various swear words, but for Isabelle, because she was so young, I chose the word pismire, which is Latin, and it comes from the word for ant. And I thought that was a perfect word for a little girl who was growing up. So that was her word at the beginning. When she fell and tore her dress, she said, pismire.
Do you remember what words you used when you were 12?
I probably said hell. And I thought that was really bad. And then when I got in the ballet company, everybody said merde, which is
right.
French for shit. But you could say merde and no one in America knows it, so it's pretty safe. But that was years later.
We're talking with Terri Lewis. Her book is Behold the Bird in Flight, a novel of an abducted queen. She had quite the adventure in this story, but you have had an extraordinary life, Terri. How did someone who began as a ballerina and spent time in the circus become an author?
I always wanted to write, and I always wanted to dance, but started in about 5th, 6th grade. I was writing little stories. I was writing letters, but I loved to dance. I loved it. It was like it took a hold of me. And so when I went to New York, I said, I have to find out if I can be a writer. So I wrote I was writing poetry at the time. I wrote some poems and I shared it with someone who knew what they were talking about. And he said, you absolutely can be a writer. And then I said, yeah, but I really want to dance. I can only dance until about 30, 35. and then I could become a writer. So I decided I would just do the dancing thing first. And I did. And then when I was done, I had a little sort of sidetrack when I was done. I had a dance company. I did choreography and so on. But when I was truly done with dancing, I said, okay, now I'm going to write. And of course, I started at the very beginning because I had been writing all the time, but I didn't have any background in it. And so I got jobs that would support me, and I got married, and I started with a crit group in New Jersey. There were like 5 of us, and we talk about writing, and everybody hated my writing because I didn't know about, I couldn't, because I came from poetry. I was interested in the words, but I wasn't that interested in tension. And so I started learning about tension, and then I went to some conferences and I talked to some agents, and that was always depressing. It's like learning to dance. You can't be a dancer. It takes 10 years to learn an art form so that you can use it to express your own artistic feelings. It took that long in dance to get the technique down so I could be an artist as a dancer. And it took that long to learn to be an artist as a writer, I guess you'd say.
And as part of your journey, you found who you thought were the best people in that space to learn from. How did you decide who to talk to? How did you approach them? And what was the biggest gift they gave you?
I was a huge reader, and I always read literary fiction. Some historic fiction thrown in, some popular, but really literary fiction. And I fell in love with Rebecca Mackay's writing. Her stories just killed me. She's the only writer, I think, who ever was in the best American short stories for 4 years in a row. And then I was living in DC at the time, and I saw that she was going to be speaking there. And I also saw that she was going to be on Facebook doing a talk. This is before she got really famous. And so I joined the Facebook talk, and we got to ask a question, and I asked her, because it was about her first novel. And I said, how did she feel about moving from being a writer of stories to a writer of novels? And she answered it. And then after it was over, someone won a book, and she chose me because I asked that question. So then I saw that she was going to be talking in DC, and I said, I'm going to go and hear her talk. So I went and I talked to her, and she just, the way she describes writing and things that you want to learn really resonated with me. So in the meantime, I moved from DC to Denver. We arrived in the pandemic, and I had left behind a couple of critique groups in DC. They have a really good writing center, the Bethesda Writers Center. I had friends there, and I thought, oh, I'm going to get to Denver. What will I find? And in Denver, I found Lighthouse. And Lighthouse Writers they've made my writing life. When I first got there in the pandemic, they had an advanced workshop. They have this thing called Lit Fest, and it's a big summer deal. It's a week-long, huge deal. And Rebecca Mackay was teaching an advanced workshop. And I had to apply, and I had started a story that I thought was going to be interesting, and I submitted it, and I was chosen. I was one of 10, I think there were 15 maybe of us in that workshop. And by the way, that workshop, we still get together. This was during the pandemic. We've been meeting for 5 years. So that was the start. Then the next year I applied, and I was accepted to Laura Vandenberg's workshop. And she took me ways further, and she gave me confidence. She actually recommended me to a couple of very fine literary journals, and my story wasn't accepted, but I got feedback from them. So all along, I've had this help. And also, I have to say, I have a critique partner that came out of that Rebecca Mackay workshop. And it's very interesting because I'm very literary minded, and she writes more genre. And what we've been able to push each other in a direction that expands our own writing. And she's been a perfect critique partner for me. And one of these days she'll get something published and it'll be great.
Terri Lewis is our guest. We're talking about Behold the Bird in Flight, a novel of an abducted queen. Isabelle is such an interesting historical figure, and you're bringing her to the forefront of our consciousness again. What was the most surprising thing you discovered about her?
I think I was most surprised that she left her children in England. And I understand how that happened. She was, I'm pretty sure, very unhappy in England. To her, it was a dark place. France, and this is probably from my travels, right? So it always rains when you're in England, and it's always sunny when you're in France. I don't know why it works out that way, but it does. And of course, I put that kind of viewpoint into the novel. But her children saved her with her husband because he had to have someone to become king afterwards, and her first child was a boy. In that time period, your child was taken away from you. A queen would have a wet nurse, someone who would nurse the child, so there wouldn't be that bonding. And at 6, the child who was going to be a king or someone royal would be sent away to learn what he needed to learn. He had to be independent. He had to think for himself. He had to learn Latin. He had to learn how to fight. There were a jillion things he needed to learn. And oh, by the way, the same thing happened for the girls. That was interesting to me when I studied what Isabel's childhood would have been like. She would have been trained because she was going to be a countess. Her father was a count. She would be trained to run a castle. And that means from the time she was little, she had jobs, and she learned how to take care of the bees, or she learned how to handle the fabric, how to cut it, because she would be in control of supplies. So how much did you give to the seamstress? How many spices did you give out to your cook? Where did you keep the keys? How were things stored and kept? So she learned all those things. That was a surprise to me too. You don't think about kids being trained like that. Our kids nowadays, they get different kind of training. So, but go back to the children. She had 5 children, and the boys she had 2. The first 2 were boys, and they were taken away from her quite early. Even though the country was always at war, still, John said they need to be trained properly. And so when she left England, she basically left them behind. And that was because she had ties to them, but her ties to France somehow remained stronger. This is in my telling, you have to understand. But I did have the book read by a woman she's a member of the Royal Historical Society in England. And she said, I made some mistakes. We talked about some of my mistakes, but she said she thought it was an astonishing recreation, that I had really brought Isabelle to life. So I was thrilled about that. Her name is Sharon Connolly Bennett, and her books about the kings and queens of that period. She writes mostly nonfiction, but oh my goodness, it's astonishing the amount that she knows.
How did you get the courage to reach out to her?
I was on Facebook, and I was watching her. She has a blog called The History, The Interesting Bits. And those are the bits of history I was interested in, how people reacted. She tells stories about queens that were, when your husband died, even if you were just a count or something, you had to have children. And so they were passed around like packages from husband to husband. Anyway, I was fascinated with her stuff, and I started commenting on it. And we got to talking back and forth. And so then I asked her if she would review my book. And she said, oh, yes, she'd love to. And I sent her, it wasn't published yet. It was just a PDF. And then I didn't hear from her for a month and a half. And I was like, oh, no, she hates it. She hates it. So finally, I got up my courage and I pinged her on Facebook. We were friends, and said, you absolutely hate me. And she said, no, I have a book that's coming out and I love it, and I'll get back to you in a week. So that worked out great.
The whole process of creation through publication is a roller coaster of emotional ups and downs. Why do you go through all of that, and why do you write?
I don't know. It's just, I feel like it was like dancing. I have to write. I've been writing. When I first started the process, I said, now, can I write a novel? So I wrote it. I was working full time at the time and had a very demanding job. And so I would write it at night in bed by hand before I went to sleep, because in order to write, my mind needs to be open. And when you're getting ready to go to sleep, your things drift off and you're in that liminal space. So I would write at night. And when I finished it, I was like, oh my God, I wrote a novel. I didn't care if it was good or not. I liked it, but I do another one. And over the course of time, I've written, I think, 6 novels, 5 novels and a novella. And this one's being published now. And I won a prize this year. Did you read about that? I won the Miami University Press 2025 Novella Prize. And that was an astonishing thing too, because I ran into a deadline at the end and I didn't have time to finish the ending. So I did a Hail Mary ending and sent it off. And I thought, oh, no way, I've got to win that prize. And when I won, I yelled so loud, my husband thought I'd hurt myself. And they only took it if I would fix the ending. And so, of course, I'm thrilled because now I can make it into the novella I wanted it to be. I have another book coming out after that one. It's also historical fiction. It's set around the time of Roe v. Wade, and it follows a couple of ballet dancers and how their pregnancies and decisions affect their lives.
What would you say is your most memorable moment on stage as a dancer?
What I remember most about being on stage was being lifted. You know, in ballet, you're lifted. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes as you went up, you felt like this is what it's about. This is the joy. This is the lightness. It can be an absolute thrill. And it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you would be so exhausted, am I going to get through this at the end? But I want to pinpoint something that happened to me, not on stage. It was, I was in a summer workshop with a quite famous choreographer, Fernand Knoll, and he led the Royal Ballet Canadien. And I was in his piece. It was wonderful. It was a great piece, Carmina Burana. And then that was with my ballet company in Denver. A couple years later, he set it on Le Grand Ballet Canadien. And I flew. It's my first flight. I flew up there to see it. I was invited to be at the party afterwards and everything. And I was there with all these professional dancers. I wasn't at the time. And when Fernand saw me, he came over. I'm going to cry. He came over to me and he said, here you are. You've been an artist from a very young age. And little to have that recognition, it meant everything to me, even though I wasn't professional yet. And so it's little things like that keep you going.
What's it like for you when the muse is singing and the words are flowing through you and not from you?
It's like going unconscious, you know, it just, and heaven knows it doesn't happen that often. I'm terrible at first drafts. I hate first drafts. I'm a 500 word a day person if I'm lucky. But sometimes something will just zing out. Try to think if it happened in Behold the Word. Yes, there was a fight. I had to write a fight scene towards the end of the novel. And I just saw it. I heard the sword. She was drawing the sword along the stone, and John was yelling, and her child was crying, and there were people looking over everything. It just came to me. And when that happened, this is like you're inside of it, just recording it. It's not, you're not thinking it up. And that's really wonderful.
What do you hope people will take away from their experience with Behold the Bird in Flight?
I hope they'll realize that even when the society seems unusual to us, when the mores are different, that the people who were living it were like us. I mean, they were shaped in different ways, but when I did Isabelle at 12, I could think about what I was like at 12. When I did Isabelle, thinking about getting married and being in a marriage bed, I thought about how did I feel when I didn't understand what sex was? And her experience with her friend's childbirth. There were all those things that, to me, she was inside of as a person. And I think that's important because lots of times we get the battles, we get the power, we get the Pope and the king and everything. But all around those people are other real people that we don't really know about. And I would like the readers of my book to understand, yes, they were real people, they had real lives, and to see that they're not that different from us.
The website is terrilewis1.com. That's spelled TerriLewis and the number 1.com. And the book is Behold the Bird in Flight, a novel of an abducted queen, by our special guest, Terri Lewis. Terri, thanks so much for the conversation.
I just loved it. Thank you for relaxing me. I really enjoyed this.
In Conversation with Terri Shepherd is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terri Shepherd next time in Conversation.